Alrighty, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and this week we are going to continue reading through the Rim of Morning short story, well, not short story, but two-book science fiction double feature. Let's go with that. The Rim of Morning science fiction double feature by William Sloane. Previously we got through To Walk the Night, and in this one, we are going to start The Edge of Running Water, which, for my money, is pretty good. I was very pleased with it myself. Let me see just how much time I'm going to have available, because I am somewhat tight on that this week. Today, anyway. Oh, come on, where are you? No, that's too few pages. You people deserve more than that. Where are you? Trying to find where this chapter ends. There it is. Okay. I think we can do better than that. Let's get that far and then see how we are at. Okay. So going into this, let's see, what can I say that isn't going to be told you? Pretty much immediately. It's pretty similar to the last one. It is first-person perspective. It is a man who is responding to a note that he has received, or a letter, or a summons from an old work colleague slash friend. And he is checking out what's going on, because things seem off. So I will leave it at that. I forgot to turn off that so people can actually see the cover. Well, that's the edition that I'm working off of. I don't know that it's still in print, but it's so recently in print, it should be pretty doable to get a copy. I do actually recommend it if you like kind of... I don't know if I'd call it analog horror, or it's touted as being cosmic horror, and part of me agrees with that and part of me doesn't. I have certain assumptions when I hear the term cosmic horror. Admittedly, the last story, To Walk the Night, comes pretty close to that definition. What I do like about these two tales by Sloane is they are very... they're very personal in scope. They're pretty narrow. It's not, oh, here's this guy who's encountering all the dark underbelly horror secrets of the universe and they're overwhelming his sanity. It's more, here's a guy who knows a guy who is encountering, and he or they are encountering something more, something difficult to explain, or there's more significant personal meaning to the horror involved. What that actually means here in the case of this one is quite a slow burn. It takes a while till we get to the point. Whereas on the previous there were hints pretty early. This one kind of moves you along fairly slowly. But I do like the way it does a good job of ratcheting it up, using a certain degree of foreshadowing. It's just a fun time in general. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. So with that, let's get rocking and a-rolling, and we will start The Edge of Running Water presently. The Edge... Oh, I didn't press the button. The Edge of Running Water by William Sloane. Chapter 1. The man for whom this story is told may or may not be alive. If he is, I do not know his name, where he lives, or anything at all about him, except that there is something which it is vital for me to tell him. It is a strange, clumsy method of communication, this expedient of writing an entire book without even the certainty that it will come into his hands, and yet I can see no other way of warning him. There is, I think, a good chance that it will succeed. Some day, perhaps in a bookstore, perhaps in a library, he may come on a copy of this narrative. Or someone he knows will innocently mention it in his hearing, and he will be impelled to seek the book out and read it. People somehow manage to learn of the things that are supremely important to their lives or their work. What troubles me is not so much the possibility that he will never come on this message as that it may already be too late. A great deal of what happened to Julian Blair, Mrs. Walters, Anne, and the rest of us there in the house on Setauket Point is purely personal. I suspect that the man whose attention I must catch will be impatient with all that. He will wonder why I have wasted so much of his time with irrelevancies of thought and feeling. Julian himself would disapprove of my presenting the facts in the form of a narrative. And yet, that is the only way I can see to bring home the actual meaning of his project, the significance it will hold for living men and women, and the human effect it must inevitably have. It would be comfortable to believe that there is no danger, that Julian's research was an isolated, aberrant thing that could not conceivably be repeated. But that is not the history of discovery. It is a curious fact that men who know nothing of each other tend to work in the same direction at the same time. Darwin and Wallace, Mendel and De Vries, Blair and... It is that unknown name that I have got somehow to reach. If this man for whom I am writing exists, if he has already begun to ravel out the same thread that Julian Blair followed, I think to the very end, the chances are that no one else will know what he is doing. He will go quietly about his business, taking nobody into his confidence until his apparatus is complete. At least that is the way Julian did it. Then, unless what I have to say here deters him, he will test the thing he has created. The moment he does so, he will learn something that even I do not know. He will find out where Julian Blair is now. That question must never be answered. A year ago, it would have seemed to me ridiculous to assume that there are some facts it is better not to know, and even today I do not believe in the bliss of ignorance or the folly of knowledge. But this one thing is best left untouched. It rips the fabric of human existence from throat to hem and leaves us naked to a wind as cold as the space between the stars. The fringe of that cold touched me once. I know what I am talking about. Chapter 2. The porter woke me at 6 that morning. My mind came back from wherever it goes during sleep and reluctantly took up the business of apprehending the outside world. It began to listen to the roaring clamor of wheels on rails and observe through a gray-green Pullman twilight the steel curve of the car roof close over my head. Pullman being a Pullman car, fancy, usually a sleepover car on a train. But beyond being aware of these things, I had no part in them. As always when I wake, this was that interval of physical paralysis when bodily motion is out of the question, and this time it was evidently going to be harder than usual to emerge from it. The muscles of my legs and back were stiff from offsetting the irregular lurching drive of the train's northward flight. Consciousness and body lay together in my berth, not yet articulated with the other and accepting their particular discomforts passively.
Then they flowed together in one sharp synthesis, and I remembered who and where I was. There is something stupefying about the noise and motion of a running train. I felt drugged, reluctant to face the prospect of a new day, and more tired than when I had finally managed to fall asleep in the small hours of the night before. But the porter's hand was thumping insistently against the green curtain.
Barsham Harbor in 20 minutes, boss. Better be getting up.
All right, thanks. Or rather, all right, thanks. My whisper must have suggested how thankful I was, because he chuckled as he moved away down the aisle. I began to wrestle my way into my clothes. The process of getting dressed in an upper berth is degrading, especially for a man of my height. It took me so long that by the time I got to the washroom there was no time to shave. The place smelled stalely of last night's cigars, and the water was lukewarm. I cursed myself, the hour, the railroad company, and everything else I could think of, including the necessity for hurry. The whole trip was probably unnecessary anyway. Even before the last strap on my bag was tugged and buckled, the brakes were beginning to grind heavily under the floor. The sleep I hadn't had was heavy behind my eyes, and there was a flat taste in my mouth. I stumbled down the Pullman steps and onto the rickety boards of the station platform at Barsham Harbor, completely unprepared for the impact of a Maine morning in September. Its sharp brightness struck me like a physical blow, and suddenly I was wide awake. The sun must have been up for a good hour before I landed on that platform, but a night coldness was still in the air. I shivered as I drew in my first breaths of it. Behind me, in the sleeping car Western Lake, the atmosphere was part of the New York I had left 7 hours ago. It had been warm, heavy with the exhalations of people and machinery. This stuff I was taking into my lungs now was different, thin, cold, and reporting the open sweep of fields, hills, and the river. I felt bewildered and out of place. This entry into an unfamiliar air and landscape was too abrupt. The porter took my tip with a sleepy mumble of acknowledgment and slung his metal stepping stool back into the car. When he heaved himself up after it, there was a sudden wrench in my mind, as if I were losing a friend. He was my last contact with the familiar things I had abandoned to come up to this god-forsaken place, and I didn't want him to leave me behind. For one instant I had an impulse to toss my bag up into the vestibule after him, swing aboard, and go on with the train. It would be returning to New York that night, I thought, and I wanted to be on it when it did. The prompting not to be left was so strong that I stooped and actually caught hold of the suitcase handle. Given 2 more seconds of grace, I might really have got back aboard. I don't know. It was a strong impulse, and as I think over the steps by which I became involved in the mystery and the disappearance of Julian Blair, it is easy to believe that there was something prophetic about it. There's no great difficulty about being wise after the event. Anyhow, as I lifted the bag, the train hissed, clanked, and began to move. The opportunity was gone. Not that I knew it was an opportunity. At the moment, I was surprised at myself. A psychologist, particularly one with enough confidence in his science to spend his life teaching its rudiments to the youth and flower of a reputable university, had no business giving in to such infantile whimsies as that half-effort of mine to return to the train. So I reminded myself, but instead of turning away at once, I stood there with my bag in my hand, watching the steel walls of the Pullmans moving past my eyes in a crescendo of speed and irrevocability. One part of my mind, the professional part, informed me that I was acting like a fool, but there was a less articulate something that reproached me for not being on it. "Why?" I demanded impatiently, but there was no answer. Not then, at any rate. With a dwindling roar, the train shrank down the track, and I turned to confront Barsham Harbor and whatever the day was to produce. The most immediate fact was that Julian had not come to the station to meet me. Of course, I knew him too well to suppose it would even occur to him to come, but when I saw he wasn't on hand, I damned him under my breath all the same. Anne was not there either, and I discovered that I was disappointed about that. 5 years ago, she would have insisted on welcoming me, would, as a matter of fact, have driven the car down herself and let the policeman who didn't approve of 15-year-old girls driving lump it. No doubt she had changed. She was 20 now, of course, even at 20, most women have developed a reluctance to getting up with the sun. For that matter, I admitted to myself, so have most men. That's charitable of him. None of which went far toward deciding what I was supposed to do next. Hire a car, presumably, and go on out to the house, wherever it was. On that point, Julian's letter, to my city mind, had not seemed very helpful. I hauled it out of my pocket and looked at it again to make sure.
Barsham Harbor, Maine, September 2nd. Dear Richard, I have been extremely busy since we last saw each other. My work has now reached the point where I am in need of your friendly advice and counsel. The problem is one on which you should be willing to consult only such an old friend as yourself. The problem is one on which I should be willing to consult only such an old friend as yourself. If you possibly can, please come up for a few days before the academic year begins. I beg you not to fail me, if only for the sake of auld lang syne. Anne is with me, of course, and anxious to see Uncle Dick again. Come as soon as you can, the sooner the better. I think I can promise you that this is profoundly important.
Sincerely, Julian Blair. Characteristically, there was a postscript added with a blunt pencil at the end.
P.S. We are living in a house they call the Talcott Place. I had much rather you regarded this address and letter as confidential.
Looking it over, I had to smile. That phrase, "since we saw each other last," covered a matter of well over 4 years. But time never meant much to Julian. It had come as a shock, even to me, to realize just how long it had been since we had foregathered, and when his letter reached me, I had, in a burst of self-reproach, cancelled a number of engagements and caught the first train. Apparently, my wire asking him to meet me at the station had failed to penetrate his usual absent-minded absorption. 2 nondescript sedans were parked along the far edge of the platform, and a faded sticker on the windshield of the one on the left said, "Taxi." The driver was sitting behind his wheel, staring at the station and paying no attention to me, in spite of the fact that I was the only passenger on the train who had been fool enough to get off at Barsham Harbor. The man's indifference puzzled me. Without being insulting, there was something contemptuous about it. I didn't want to lug my suitcase across the platform and ask him if he would be so kind as to drive me away in his car, and yet that was just about what I should have to do if I didn't want to spend the morning standing right where I was. In New York, the cab drivers are actually eager to have you ride in their hacks, but not this man. Before I approached him, I took a minute to survey the town, this place to which Julian Blair had seen fit to come for some obscure reason of his own. My heart sank as I stared toward it. There was something malapropos about the idea of Julian's living in this village. It didn't even look as if the local power plant would be able to supply enough electricity for his ordinary laboratory requirements, assuming that he had built a laboratory. He certainly wouldn't find one ready-made in this fly-in amber of a colonial town. The thought of a great electrophysicist in a place that looked as if it might still be using whale oil lamps was incongruous. An uneasiness crept into my mind. Quaint, even beautiful as this town was, it was no place for Julian Blair unless... I disliked putting the thought clearly, even to myself, but what it amounted to was, unless he wanted to be secret, unless what he was doing was something as unbalanced and pitiful as the obsession that had led to his leaving the university almost 5 years ago. Barsham Harbor is built on the rising land along the right bank of the Kennebec. Its main street runs diagonally away from the station, where I was standing, toward the water, and it is no level city avenue, but a dirt-surfaced town road that dips and rises to the modeling of the land itself. The huge old trees on each side of the way were solid fountains of green that morning, jetting superbly up against a thin blue sky. Between their boles I could see the white fronts of the houses, square, solid, 3 stories high. Most of them seemed to have porticoed fronts that expressed inescapably what the people who originally built these houses had thought of themselves. Above the trees, one sudden narrow spire leaped up into the morning sun and glittered like hammered metal. Beyond the trees and the houses I saw that the road dipped again, and the distant buildings there looked gray and weathered. Stores, probably. In the notch between the last of them was a fleck of blue water, like a tile in a mosaic, and past that again a distant row of hills on the other side of the valley, checkered minutely with farms and wood lots. A lot where you have wood. The whole air of the landscape was glowing with the early sun and the reflected light from the broad surface of the Kennebec. Yes, impossible as it would be for me to return to it, there is no denying the fact that Barsham Harbor is beautiful. 100 years and more ago, when it was alive, when it had some meaning and significance of its own, it must have been comparable to any town of its size in the world. Those were the days when Kennebec men were building and sailing the fast ships that had gone down this river before me and away to the 4 corners of the world. In the sweltering ports of Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, they had sold their cargoes and even their ballast, great chunks of ice sawed in blocks from the frozen river itself and worth a fortune in the heat of the tropics. They had come home again with gold clinking in their strong boxes, and their holds full of rums, silks, spices, tea, all the wealth of Ormus and of Ind for Yankee merchants in Boston, Portland, and Bath. Their captains and owners had built those pillared houses in the days when Barsham Harbor was closer to India than to Illinois. On that bright morning their town was as clear and unchanging as the profile on a Roman cameo. Dead for a century though it had been, its aspect was still beautiful and proud. In all the future decades and centuries through which the town might manage to preserve its shell, I could not imagine that anything of importance would ever happen here again. As I looked at those white houses, they seemed as truly mausoleums as if they had stood... Oh, okay, I see. My brain got caught up on the line break. As I looked at those white houses, they seemed as truly mausoleums as if they had stood in a cemetery. The past was buried in them, not to stir again until the day of resurrection. Barsham Harbor was through with life and with the only phase of time which matters to living beings, the duration of change. I was wrong about that. One thing more was to happen in Barsham Harbor, a thing both violent and terrible, which its citizens have surely not understood to this day. It is incredible that with even an inkling of the truth behind the events to which they were all witnesses, those people could go on living in their village. It is hard enough even for me to sleep without dreaming of it. How can they look down their own streets and across the river to the point where Julian's house once stood, without feeling the hairs lift on the backs of their necks? I wonder that they can walk the streets of their town and not know that every shadow is haunted. There must be something that is more than night darkness in their lanes after the sun has set. What do they think when they turn their eyes toward Setauket Point, black against the water? Even in the calmest weather, the villagers along the lower Mississippi look now and again toward the levee that rises above their roofs. Where the river in flood has once broken through, there can be no absolute security and peace again. Hysterical words. Perhaps I don't mean them too literally. After all, no further danger exists for those townsmen. Lightning does not strike twice in the same place, and if the thing I mean continues to exist at all, it does so only in the brain of some man who, like Julian Blair, sets out to travel one certain, dreadful roadway of the mind. It is the people around that man who are in danger without knowing it, not the folk of Barsham Harbor. They are as safe as any of the rest of us. Cut as they are from the remnants of a greater cloth than they can weave for themselves, they are unlikely to produce a man or woman who will duplicate Julian's experiment. Even while he was there among them, they did not know what he was about, really. They simply resented him with the blindly obstinate dislike of the countryman for the foreigner. Now that he is never coming back, they will have forgotten him in a year or two more. Chapter 3. For the second time, I stooped to the handle of my suitcase. However unlikely Barsham Harbor might look, it was Julian's address and my destination. I was impatient to finish my journey. Also, there was a hollow under my belt where no breakfast rested as yet, and I wanted to fill that. I crossed the platform and halted beside the sedan. "Good morning," I said. No reply. The driver went on looking into space. "Is this a taxicab?" He turned his head deliberately. Then, He turned his head deliberately then, and looked me over from head to foot without speaking. There was no expression on his narrow face or around the pale flatness of his eyes. When his inspection was completed, he nodded once and said, "Ah." The man was disconcerting, and, when I spoke again, it annoyed me to hear that my tone sounded apologetic. I was expecting a friend to meet me, but he doesn't seem to have showed up. I suppose I better go out to his place. It's Mr. Blair. He lives in the old Talcott house. Something happened behind the flat eyes that were watching me, but I couldn't tell what it was. After a minute, he looked away and said indifferently, "Reckon I know where it is." He thrust back a thin brown arm and opened a tonneau door beside me. I slung in my bag and started to follow it. "It'll be $1, he said. "That's all right. Do you want me to pay you now?" "Please yourself." I took a bill out of my pocket at once. Something in his manner made me want to put him in my debt. "Here," I told him, "and if you're not sure about the place, we can ask in town." He was putting the bill into a battered wallet with meticulous care and thoroughness. "I said I knew where it was." After buttoning his wallet into a hip pocket, he added, "Don't have much occasion to go out that way lately." "I suppose not," I said. "To tell you the truth, I didn't expect to find anyone who would know the way so easily. Mr. Blair's letter wasn't very clear on directions. I wasn't sure anybody would know where he lived." He smiled temporarily, and his teeth were the yellow-brown of a tobacco chewer's. Later, I understood that smile. It was from my city man's assumption that anyone could live in Barsham Harbor for more than a few days without being known to every living inhabitant. When he was through being amused, the same indifference, tinged with something stronger this time, returned to his manner. "Everybody around here knows the Talcott place," he remarked briefly and swung the car down the station drive. I settled back in my seat with a grunt. "Oh," I remembered suddenly, "I haven't had any breakfast yet. Is there a place in town where I can get something?" "Light'll be open, I reckon," he said, and cut the car into the street. We went unhurriedly down along its rolling length with the high white houses on either side of us. Most of their windows were still shuttered, but the chimneys were still smoking. Most of their windows were still shuttered, but the chimneys were smoking. Except for that, there was scarcely an indication of life. Our car was the only moving object in sight. Everything else seemed transfixed by the brightness of the morning. The driver cleared his throat. "That'll be extra," he observed. I reassured him. "All right, but I won't keep you waiting long. How much of a trip out there is it, anyway?" For all I knew, the house might be right in the town. If it was, then his charge of $1 was robbery. When he said, "About 6 miles," I felt better. The 4 business blocks, when we reached them, were a seedy contrast to the stately places we had been passing. Most of the stores were cheaply constructed frame buildings in need of paint, and their show windows were not quite clean. The merchandise behind them looked as if it had been there a long time. More than anything else, this part of town was without any character of its own. It might as well have been a place of Gary, Indiana, or Gallup, New Mexico. The Elite lunch turned out to be an epitome of the meager standardization of the rest. Its nickel coffee urn was not tarnished, but neither was it bright. The stools along the counter were upholstered in a sleazy imitation red leather, and there was a perceptible film of grease on the surface of the white table where I ate my breakfast. That meal was far from elite. The coffee was hot enough, but thin and bitter, the egg hinted at cold storage, and the toast was abominable. But I downed all three, and the emptiness under my belt disappeared. Some of the uncomfortableness with which the day had begun faded from my mind, but not all of it. The more I saw of the town, the less I could understand Julian's being here. It had gone to seed too obviously. The street beyond my window was rutted and lined on its opposite side with haggard ice houses and frowsy garages. There was litter around them all. The clean sweep of the river, which I could glimpse between them, was a pleasant contrast. It was inconceivable that there was a decent laboratory within 100 miles of this place. It takes apparatus and a complex set of facilities to work in the field of electrophysics today, and usually a staff of research assistants. Surely Julian didn't have money enough to build and equip a complete place of his own. Even if he had, why locate it here? What had his letter meant by advice? The only advice that occurred to me then was to tell him to get out of this place and back into the world where he belonged. There was just one answer. He was still living in that tragic dream, born of despair and grief, that had taken possession of him the day of Helen's funeral. He had come here to work on it in secret because there was enough of the old Julian left, somewhere, to realize what his colleagues would think of him if they got wind of it. He had not been able to reconcile himself to the fact of her death, and now, after years of inevitably wasted time and effort, he wanted help of some sort from me. How could I help him? What I suspected him of needing was a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. None of us at the university had heard from Julian for so long that if we had not forgotten him, we had pretty well stopped talking about him. The offer of his old chair in the physics department was still open, of course, and Arthur Wallace and I had occasionally talked over ways and means of persuading him to come back to it, until one day we realized that we no longer even knew where he was. That had been Julian's fault, too, for he had never answered our letters. For a time I had felt that I ought to keep in touch with him merely in order to be sure that Anne was all right. But after her note telling me that she was going abroad to study, even that motive disappeared. The memory of Julian had retreated into the background of my mind. In saying that I seldom thought of him, I don't mean to imply that I had forgotten him. There were too many ties between us for that. The earliest went back to the years when I had been struggling to earn my way through college, tending lawns, firing furnaces, even washing dishes for the education that I was so determined to get. Julian had somehow picked me from his entire sophomore physics course for special attention, and, when he found out my circumstances, he made me give up all my outside jobs and work for him as a laboratory assistant. He did it without sentiment, merely as though he were arranging the apparatus for an experiment, but I think he saw something in me that pleased him. Our relationship was a curious one, utterly impersonal and yet intensely close by the very nature of the work together. He had a driving scientific passion for discovery and the apprehension of truth that stimulated me. I learned from him then that the universe was larger than man. I came, in time, to be fond of him, as well as grateful. There was that passed between us, and another. About it I shall have more to say later, but the fact that we both loved the same woman kept us together even when I had gone into a different field of work and begun to teach. I thought of Helen often enough, and that meant thinking of Julian too, at least indirectly. He and I shared work, love, and grief in a curious pattern. I found myself half afraid to see him. The things that we had in common were strong and deep, and I did not know what they would do to me if they were to rise up again after the truce of years. Well, there was no use speculating or opening up old unhappinesses. I paid for my breakfast and went out to the car. As I came through the door, I saw that my driver was still sitting behind the wheel. Beside the car, with one foot on the running board, was a thin, sharp-faced man in blue jeans and a white shirt open at the neck. My driver and this fellow were two of a kind, I thought, a kind that I did not understand and felt ill at ease about, without knowing exactly why. When I came out of the Elite lunch, neither of them was talking, but I had a suspicion that they had been, a moment before. Oh, okay. I see what I did. When I came out of the Elite lunch, neither of them was talking, but I had a suspicion that they had been, a moment before, and about me. Why it should be so disquieting to think that strangers have been discussing you, I don't exactly know, but it is. I crossed the sidewalk swiftly and got into the back of the car again. The stranger, with one foot on the running board, bent his body just enough to let me get in without my having actually to shoulder him out of the way. "All set," I informed the driver. The thin man nodded to him and moved off down the street without a word. His gait was loose and bent-kneed. The way a man places his feet reveals whether he is accustomed to pavements or the ridges and furrows of plowed fields. At the end of the street, we swung left and began to go north along a tree-lined road that followed the level of the river and sometimes ran along the very edge of the water. Within 5 minutes, the houses of the town were behind us. In another 5, the farms at our left had given way to marshy pasture land. All at once, we left this river road, angled abruptly right, and rattled across an unrailed wooden bridge spanning a sluggish creek. The Kennebec appeared to have swung to the east of us, and I realized that for the last mile or two we had been skirting a bay in the lee of a promontory. Our new road bent constantly further to the right until I saw that we were running almost due south. "This here's the point." "I see," I replied, wondering why he had suddenly decided to volunteer something for nothing. "Talcott's place is down at the end." It was a lonely spot, I thought, about as far out of the world as you could get without going into a wilderness. "I imagined Mr. Blair would be closer to town somehow," I observed. "'Tain't more'n a mile by water. You can see it right across from you at the end of River Street." "What is the place?" I asked. "A farm?" "Used to be." His tone was uninflected, but I got the impression that he thought it ought to be one still. "Mr. Blair isn't a farmer, exactly." "No." He drove on for some time without adding to his question. The car, I noticed, was going slower, and even though the road was rough, I had an idea he wanted an opportunity to talk further. "Folks around here don't exactly know what he is, anyhow," he said finally. "He's an electrophysicist," I remarked, hoping he wouldn't know what the term meant. "Do tell." His tone gave me no indication whether he did or did not know what an electrophysicist was. "Reckon you're right at that. Last summer, when he come here, he had the house wired for electricity. Edison people had to run poles in the better part of 2 miles. "Is that so?" I responded, but the information made me feel lighter at heart. Perhaps Julian was really working something important then. Anyhow, the fact that he had brought current into this remote house of his was a hopeful sign. The driver apparently thought the whole thing was a piece of folly. Yeah," he went on, and there was satisfaction in his voice. "He did, and it cost him something, I reckon." "It must have." "It must have." There was another pause while we jolted along a road that became progressively worse. Then he cleared his throat again. "Who's she? His wife?" "No," I said. "I expect you mean his sister-in-law." Some impulse made me add, "His wife's dead." The sound might have meant anything. Then he declared, "I thought that was the girl." "Yes," I said. "She must be about 20 by this time." He shook his head. "I don't mean her. The other one." "What other one?" "That woman." His tone implied that he had said all he intended to. "I didn't know there was anyone else living with him." For a time I said nothing, and then my curiosity got the better of me. What does she look like?
She ain't so much, he declared dispassionately. Maybe she's another of them electros.
I started to grin at that, but something stopped me. My eye caught the rearview mirror immediately over the driver's head. In it I could see his pale eyes watching me intently. The glass was set at the exact angle to reveal everything in the back seat. The sight of those two cold eyes turned back upon me, appraising my least gesture, suddenly gave me pause. What business of his was it how I looked, or what went on in this back seat? Did he retail the things he saw in that mirror to the whole town? Probably. This was not the city, I reminded myself. In the next breath it occurred to me that this man was more than a simple countryman. He had a quality that made me realize suddenly how much of my life had been passed in universities, where people deal with each other according to special standards and codes, and where they conduct their lives with reference to reason and logic. Those eyes were not logical or reasonable. There was intelligence behind them, plenty of it, perhaps, but not the kind of intelligence to which I was accustomed. They had, too, their own kind of curiosity, a private brand which searched for the weakness in you and found satisfaction in it. When my glance caught his eyes in the mirror, I stared steadily into them until he dropped them again to the road. I had a feeling that the man was smiling faintly. At least, the skin at the outer corners of his eyelids had been creased into wrinkles that suggested amusement. Evidently, he was not abashed at being detected in his scrutiny of myself. Our road was running almost due south still, and somewhat to the right of the middle of the promontory between the bay and the river. Toward the bay side the land was low, but on our left it pitched up toward the river so that the actual surface of the water on that side was out of sight. The fields we passed were mostly overgrown with harsh clumps of goldenrod, patches of scrub cedar, and the spindling stems of young tamaracks. There was something forlorn about the point, even in the brilliance of early morning. The occasional patches of potatoes, squash, or pumpkins only emphasized the idleness of most of the fields. These scrub trees and bushes were the outposts of the wilderness, and I had the sharp feeling that winter and the wilderness were the true season and mode of this land, that man was already in retreat before them. The road, too, was viciously potholed. Whenever a wheel dropped into one of those pits that pocked its surface, the whole frame of the car was wrenched. As someone who has lived in Maine for a while, in various points in his life, yeah, potholes. It's a way of life. You'll love it. The only other thing worth remarking was a row of raw, yellow poles running along beside us with a single strand of wire looping between them. The power line to Julian's house, I thought. The cable looked thick. We passed at least one farm shortly before we came to the end of that road. Perhaps there were more. Some things about the geography of Setauket Point will never leave my mind, but there are others about which I am not so clear. But however many places there were, Julian's was the last, clear at the end of the point. I was so busy looking out at the unfamiliar landscape that we had jolted to a halt before I saw the place, dead ahead of us.
"Here you are," the driver said, and then 50 cents additional for the wait.
I paid him because it was simpler than to haggle, though I suspected he was secretly despising me for not protesting. He took the money with a yellow grin and put it in his pocket.
"Aw, say," he added, "I got a telegram for Blair. Come in yesterday evening, but my cousin, he just couldn't get round to delivering it. Asked me to take it out this morning."
He handed me the envelope, watching me intently as I took it.
"So," I said, "I know what this is. It's my wire telling them I was coming. No wonder you were at the station. And maybe, no wonder the wire didn't get delivered. Ace has been poorly this week. He couldn't make it. You didn't get stuck at the station now, did you?"
His tone was amused. I put the envelope in my pocket. "I believe I'll report this," I said, and dragged my suitcase out of the back of the car.
"Folks around here are satisfied with Asa," he observed, still grinning.
I reckon he won't lose his job exactly, mister. I said nothing for a minute, though there were plenty of words on the lips of my mind. Then I gave him a steady smile. That'll be all. You can go back now and tell them how I looked and what I said and how you and Asa worked it so you got a call clear out here. He met my smile with one of his own. It was plain that he was enjoying this situation. We ain't so interested as all that in city people, he observed. I wouldn't mind a particle if I never seen another. That mirror of yours tells a different story. The shot told. He pulled the car into gear. Just got shooken out of true on these roads, he said, but he did not look at me. Well, if you need a cab any time, the number's 517J. Marcy's have a phone down the road a piece. First place on your right. He cut the wheel hard over, released the clutch so that the car spurted suddenly away from me, and was gone down the road. The house which I found myself confronting was old and of a sort with which I was not familiar. I was surprised to see how large and high it stood. What appeared to be the main portion was a square, two-story clapboard What appeared to be the main portion was a square, two-story clapboard building facing south. From the north wall, a single-story L extended perhaps 30 feet and linked the house proper to a barn considerably larger even than the residence part. The whole was made out of wood which the years had turned to a silver gray. The color would have delighted the eye of an artist. It was almost like that of old silver. The house had been, handsome, but to me it looked shabby and forsaken. Smoke was coming out of the chimney, but otherwise it looked abandoned. I could not even see curtains behind any of the windows. In the corner of the L, where it joined the house, was a door, but that was shut. I wondered whether I should go in there. It looked so unlike a front door that finally I carried my bag around to the south side. There was a fan-lighted door there, in the middle of the wall, but it, too, was shut, and nothing ran to it except a beaten track through the tall weeds which skirted the baseboards of the house. Impatient with my own indecision, I finally walked along this path, my bag bumping my leg at every step, and went up 3 moldering wooden steps. There was no doorbell. I knocked once or twice. No answer, but when I put my hand on the knob, it turned stiffly, and I walked in. Chapter 4. Inside the door I found myself in a rather large hall and confronting a staircase which ran steeply up through a low ceiling. The light in the hall was dim, but I could see that the woodwork had once been very fine, the balusters beautifully turned, and the ceiling molding ornamented with dentils that looked hand-cut. I put my bag down and said, "Hello, Julian," into the shadows, aware as I spoke that my voice was almost too low to hear. "Hello, Julian." "Hello, Julian." There was no answer to it anyhow, and rather than call again, I tried a door to my left. This room was even dimmer than the hall. The shutters were closed, and at first glance I thought the place was furnished. Then I realized that here was nothing but a sort of lumber room, stocked with a broken chair, heaps of excelsior, several packing cases with their sides or tops wrenched open, and a miscellaneous litter of trash. This, I thought with some surprise, must be one of the best rooms in the house, and yet here it was, full of old junk that belonged in the barn. Julian had never cared much for the niceties of housekeeping, and I would not have been surprised by mere untidiness, but it was somehow disturbing to find a room that must have been intended as a sitting room or parlor, full of nothing but discarded boxes and packing materials. I went back to the hall with a feeling of discomfort in my mind. The door to the right of the stairs opened on a room equally dim, but I saw at once that it must be where Julian lived when he was not working. In the mood that had begun to come over me, it was actually pleasant to discover that the house was really inhabited. There had been an uncomfortable emptiness in the hall. I looked round with interest. It was a long room, but wide enough to seem well proportioned except for the ceiling, which was only some 7 feet high, or perhaps a few inches more. There were 3 windows in the wall facing me, and 2 more in the wall on my right, but all of them were shuttered. Suddenly I found myself oppressed by the dimnesses. Yes, plural. Suddenly I found myself oppressed by the dimnesses of this house, the way it was closed in upon itself, and I did something which under more conventional circumstances I should not have dreamed of. I went over to the nearest window, opened it, and threw back the shutters. Light streamed in with the intensity of a magnesium flare. The river was acting like a great reflecting mirror. It hurled the morning sun through the breach I had made in the house's defenses. The room leaped into view with a sudden sharpness that was cruel. The shabby furniture, the faded pattern of the wallpaper, the threadbare patches in the dull rug were exposed with bitter emphasis. My first impression was that the place was dowdy beyond belief and ill cared for. Not that I have the tender sensibilities of an interior decorator, but I don't like living in disorder, and this room was untidy in an unpleasant way. The fireplace at the far end was empty, but it was littered with odds and ends of refuse. There was a vase of flowers on the mantel, still fresh and glowing with color, but they served only to underline the drab dullness of walls, chairs, and woodwork. 3 or 4 books were lying on the floor in front of the sofa, one of them open and face down on the faded rug. Magazines and periodicals were heaped in unstable piles on the table. What few pieces of furniture there were looked as if they had been stationed around the room without regard to proportion or comfort. I noticed that the lamp on a table between two of the windows was greasy with kerosene and had a sooted chimney. Then I saw beneath the superficial appearances of the room. Whoever had built the place, presumably the Talcotts, had known how to take advantage of a lordly sight. As I went from window to window, throwing open the shutters, the whole sweep of the river came before my eyes. This was the tip of the promontory, and the room seemed built almost over the water itself. The 2 south windows looked downstream and revealed the great sweep of the Kennebec's course for miles. It almost seemed that in the clear sharpness of this morning I ought to make out the blue shimmer of the distant sea. The 3 windows along the eastern wall looked across the water also, the width of the Kennebec itself. The river came down out of nowhere in a broad arc and leaned against the peninsula before it swung off toward Merrymeeting Bay and the ocean. Looking out of those windows, I half wondered why the pressure of that running water did not sweep the house away, but I was to learn that the eastern edge of Setauket Point was a natural dike of rock that was a match even for the river, and which lifted the house above the spring floods and winter ice. Decidedly, it was a seaman's location. I felt as though I were in the chart-house of a vessel, and if the first Talcott had not been a sea captain, I missed my guess. The very loneliness of the spot where he had chosen to put up his mansion must have reminded him of the space and desert of the sea. I stood in that faded, splendid room, looking out across water and half hypnotized by the dazzle of the sun, and thought that this was no less surprising, in its way, than the idea of Julian's coming to Barsham Harbor. That he should have settled in such a house was beyond me then. In a way, it still is. And yet there was a certain rightness about it, as I was to learn.
Well?
The voice came from behind me. It was sharply interrogatory, hard, but with something musical in it all the same. I whirled around, feeling like a child detected in naughtiness. A woman was standing in the doorway, looking at me without moving. Seeing the bulk of her, I wondered how she had managed to come within 10 feet of me without making enough sound to attract my attention. She must have weighed all of 180 pounds, and her big, loose-coupled body did not look as if it were easy to control. I knew at once that this must be the woman about whom the taxi driver had been talking about. My brain is editorializing, and it needs to not do that. I knew at once that this must be the woman about whom the taxi driver had been talking when he asked who she was. It was easy to see why she puzzled him and the rest of Barsham Harbor. My first flashing impression was that she looked as if she had once been a queen, and then I recognized that there was something less imperious, perhaps more assertive, about her. The two impressions sound mutually exclusive, and yet there was truth in both of them. For a moment I stared at her, too surprised to speak. Her obvious force and quality were so startlingly offset by the body that housed them. Apparently she had run to flesh as she grew older. There were heavy slabs of it on her arms, which were bare and soft, but not mottled, as the skin of older women who put on weight so often is. Under the lusterless black of her dress, her thighs looked tremendous, but her ankles were as thin as a girl's. Her feet looked almost tiny. I wondered how they managed to carry her bulk. She had the bosom of a retired opera diva. But for all her grossness, she carried herself with strength and purpose. There was no degeneration in that body of hers. There was too much powder and rouge on her face. The accented red of her lips, the artificial shadowing under the eyes, the white dusting on nose and chin, might not have been so conspicuous in the evening, but in the harsh brightness of this Maine morning streaming through the windows, she looked raddled. Like her body, her chin and cheeks had gone to flesh, but under it was the architecture of what must have once been... Like her body, her chin and cheeks had gone to flesh, but under it was the architecture of what must once have been striking beauty, with wide, sharply planed cheekbones and a broad forehead. Her eyes were what remained of that magnificence, dark so that I could see no bottom to them, and full of splendor. More than anything else about her, they accounted for the effect of something regal in her appearance. She was looking at me out of them with the unconscious authority of a woman who does not have to ask for anything, but merely demands or takes it. "Well?" she inquired again. The way she said that one word made me eager to explain myself. I beg your pardon," I began inanely. "I was just opening the shutters to get a little light in here." "I can see what you were doing." "My name is Richard Sayles." There was no sign that it meant anything to her, so I added, "Julian's friend." "I have never heard of you." Something about the way she said that made me think twice and decide not to retort in kind. Instead, I bowed and pulled Julian's letter out of my pocket. "He wrote asking me to come at once," I said firmly. She held out her hand for the letter. "He said nothing to me." I did not hand her the letter. "Really," I told her, "this seems like an unfortunate way for us to meet. I have taken a liberty in walking in on you this way, but I have known Julian a long time." She said nothing, so I underlined it for her. "I am afraid I don't even know who you are." "Mrs. Walters!" Her tone was impatient. I bowed again. "See here," she began. "Julian doesn't want to see anyone. I think you must be mistaken." "Not at all," I replied, putting the letter back in my pocket. "If you'll just tell him I'm here, I think he will confirm what I've said." Evidently she recognized an impasse when she came to one. "He's asleep. He was working late last night. I don't want to wake him." "Please don't," I begged her. "There's no hurry, and I'm painfully early, I know." She shook her head. "I suppose that's your suitcase in the hall?" "Yes." "You can't stay, Mr. Sayles. We don't entertain visitors here. I'm sorry that you've had your trip for nothing." I lifted my eyebrows. "Mrs. Walters, I assure you I am not a peddler or a salesman. I'm an old friend of Julian's, and he has asked me to come up here as quickly as I could. I gave up a number of things in New York to get here. I'm afraid I must insist upon seeing him. After that, if he wants me to go back, I shall only be too glad to leave." She shrugged. "You are a foolish young man. You will interrupt his work." In the letter he sent me, he speaks of that. He apparently wants to ask my advice about something connected with it. The effect of this retort of mine was surprising. The assurance faded from her stare, and she put one hand against the door jamb as if to steady herself. "Your advice?" she asked incredulously. "What sort of advice?" "I don't know." But how can you advise him?" She managed to put an unpleasant emphasis on the first pronoun. He didn't tell me that.
Did he tell you what he was doing?
Her tone was only superficially casual. Underneath its surface was a wariness, as if my answer to her question was the crux of something in her mind. No. She drew a long breath and said,
If you are an old friend of Julian's, you probably knew him when he was at the university?
When I nodded, she went on,
That was when his wife died?
Yes, I admitted.
You are much younger than Julian, she remarked. Maybe you were one of his pupils?
Well, yes, once, I admitted. I've been on the faculty for almost 10 years. Oh, she said. Then, as if she were still puzzled by something, she inquired,
Did you know Helen well?
Echoes went reverberating back and back in my mind, and I felt a natural resentment at the question. Yes, quite well. That would do for her, even if it didn't begin to express the truth. This cross-questioning began to puzzle me. What made her so assured of her right to talk to a friend of Julian's in this fashion? The calm, impersonal way she kept looking at me while she asked me things that were none of her business was a piece with her words. "Can I supply you with any further information?" I asked her. She went on looking at me for a few seconds and then held out her hand.
I'm afraid I have seemed very rude, Professor Sayles. Please excuse us. Please excuse it.
Her fingers were soft and unexpectedly cold, but there was strength in them. "Of course," I said. "After all, I did rather barge in and make myself at home." She glanced over the room with a faint smile.
Not much of a home at that, she observed. I'm afraid we've been too busy to pay much attention to the house. Julian and I are indifferent to such things.
I put out a cautious feeler. "We're all glad he's working again, Mrs. Walters. That is, I was glad to hear it, and Julian's other friends will be when they learn about it. He's too good a man, too important to—" I could not think of a diplomatic way to end the sentence.
These tragedies, Mr. Sayles, come to all of us. You cannot imagine what it means to lose touch with one you have loved.
Perhaps not. Perhaps not. I was content to let her statement ride along unchallenged. That was the easier way, and, besides, some instinct warned me against letting this woman know anything too personal. Whatever she might be to Julian, I wanted nothing to do with her. My lack of responsiveness did not seem to affect her one way or the other. She moved down the room, and now, from a position at the farthest window, inquired, "Have you had your breakfast?" "In the village, on the way out."
"That horrible little town!"
She was not even turning her head as she spoke. "It's a lovely place to look at."
"Yes," she said in the most matter-of-fact voice. "It's lovely enough. The people who live in it are the worst feature of Barsham Harbour."
I thought of the taxi driver and of his acquaintance who had moved away when I came out of the Elite lunch, and had some inkling of what she meant. But it hardly seemed probable that the rest of the village would be just like them. I made no comment on what she had said, and after a time she went on, still without bothering to look at me as she spoke.
"We have a woman, Mrs. Marcy, who comes over at 8 to cook for us and do some of the housework. We generally have our morning meal at 9 or even later. Julian is up so much of the night." She sighed. "He works too hard, but I cannot persuade him to slow down. He refuses to pay any attention to his health."
I wondered if what she was driving at was that she felt herself a martyr to Julian's habits. Perhaps she hoped I would intercede with him about staying up too late. But that was wide of the mark. She was getting at something else entirely, though I did not at first see what. "He always used to keep at it night and day when he thought he was on the track of something, in the old days at least."
"The old days," she began, and then stopped herself. "You will find him changed," she remarked, still without a glance in my direction. "I hope you won't blame me for that. I have done what I could to help him, but of course I have no right to manage his life."
Again, I had the feeling that behind the screen of her words she was trying to pass along some sort of impression to me. What it was supposed to be I could not make out, and felt the discomfort of a man who can't quite hear a whisper addressed to him. Perhaps she wanted me to understand something about her relation to Julian, but I realized that it wasn't as simple a matter as that. I decided she was trying to tell me she was not the sort of woman she imagined I must be thinking she was, that she had not simply happened upon an older man broken and at loose ends because he had lost his wife, seen her opportunity, and stepped into the gap. There was no possessiveness in the way she spoke of Julian Blair. "It's his life," I agreed. "Don't worry about it too much. We all know that Julian won't listen to anyone. Helen was the only person who ever managed to make him take care of himself." She nodded, and then she said a thing that left me staring at her. "In a way," she remarked judiciously, as if she were weighing one thing against another, "it's a pity that his wife died." "Good God," I said, "how can you talk like that?" She looked at me then, and when she spoke she sounded almost as if she were sorry, not for what she had said, but for me. "That must have sounded cold and unfeeling to you. I have a bad habit sometimes of thinking aloud. Don't misunderstand me. I was speaking purely in terms of Julian's work. Like you, Mr. Sayles, I believe in Julian, perhaps a great deal more so than you, as a matter of fact. Probably a great deal more so than you, as a matter of fact. I have made every sacrifice, contributed everything I could toward his work." My expression must have showed her what I thought of that high-flown speech, but she went on patiently. "You and I have different ideas about death, too, I don't doubt. To you it is always a tragedy. To me, seldom. Often death shows us which things are of greatest importance. This was certainly true in Julian's case." I felt out of my depth and beginning to dislike this woman more with every passing minute. All the time she was talking in this bombastic fashion she had been standing by the window, looking out at the glittering water. I saw as I watched her that the pose was theatrical, that she was looking at the river with the eyes of a gaslight tragedy queen. And yet there was something about her that was close to magnificence. I told myself that all she amounted to was a fat hulk of a woman, no longer young, in a shapeless sack of a dress and with a ruin of a face. And yet the trouble was that here was something not quite normal, a woman with an old, sagging, lined face who deliberately let the hard harshness of morning daylight play on her face. "Look," she seemed to be saying indirectly to me, "see what a mountain of a woman I am. If I was ever beautiful, you can see that there is nothing of it left." The nub of the matter was that she ought to have been ridiculous, and she wasn't. I could not feel like smiling at her, even inwardly. I tried to tell myself that this was a silly, vain old woman, but what I actually felt about her was less definable than contempt. It was a good deal closer to uneasiness. Whatever was underneath that flesh of hers and that dramatized manner, it was not weak or negligible. Julian's life must have settled into a strange pattern indeed if it included this woman. Finally, she turned away from the window, knowing that she had got her effect, and moved heavily down the room once more. There was resilience in the way she walked, for all her weight, and the boards of the old floor did not creak under her tread as you would have expected. She went past me, and I could feel the vitality in her. When she got to the doorway, she paused and said, "I'll step into the kitchen for a moment before Mrs. Marcy comes. Just to make sure we have enough to eat. You may care for a second cup of coffee, even if you've already had your breakfast." "Thank you," I said. "If you don't mind, we'll wait till later to find a room for you. The bedrooms are all upstairs, and I try to keep it quiet up there while he's asleep." "That's all right," I reassured her. "Any time will do. This is an ungodly hour at which to arrive anyhow. If there had been any other train—" "Of course, this wilderness is something that we just have to adjust ourselves to." "Sorry." "Of course, this wilderness is something that we have to adjust ourselves to." Her eyes avoided mine. "Sometimes I wish Julian hadn't felt it necessary to come here at all. But he is right, of course. The more remote we are, the better." She gave me a last quick look and went away down the hall. I settled myself down on the sofa and filled my pipe. The room was more comfortable now that she had left it, but I was far from feeling at ease. This was a curious situation into which I had strayed, and, thinking back over the preceding minutes, it seemed to me that I had told Mrs. Walters a great deal about myself in return for almost nothing in the way of information about Julian or herself. What she was doing here with them was as beyond my power to imagine as why he was here himself. Something about the woman stuck uncomfortably in my mind, something less tangible than her appearance or even the things she had said. I could not put my finger on it, but in some way it was connected with her attitude toward Julian. What was there about that which was... Oh, the line break is making my brain break. What was there about that which was peculiar? Well, the way she had said "we" in speaking about the two of them. That suggested intimacy, of course, but not the obvious kind of thing at all. There was none of that spurious tenderness that she would have employed if she'd had what used to be called designs on him. No, it was something less analyzable than that. There was a tie between them, at least in her mind, but it was not, at any remove whatever, a sexual one. She spoke almost as if she and Julian were partners in some sort of enterprise. Having thought that, I dismissed it because it seemed to me impossible that I could be right. Julian was a great scientist in his way, narrow and limited though he might be outside the field of his own work. This woman was unthinkable in the role of his assistant or collaborator. I let the thought slip away from me. That curious theatricality of hers. She had acted at moments like a woman dedicated to something, to the return of the Habsburgs, to the throne, or some other noble and semi-public conspiracy. It was something that she believed in herself, that much was plain, and in some way I suspected that it was bound up with her self-assurance. After a time I gave up the puzzle and simply sat, smoking and looking out at the river. To eyes accustomed to the Hudson, it was amazingly empty. Not one boat, large or small, appeared on the whole expanse of water visible from the windows. And except for distant rectangles of plowed fields and the roofs of a few diminutive houses on the opposite shore, it might have been a wilderness river, more primeval than it had been a century before. Staring at the long blue sweep of it and the unchanging outline of the hills beyond, the utter absence of humanity from the scene began to depress me. This was a lonely house and a lonely valley. It was not part of the modern world to which I belonged. That was a peopled world, full of human beings and their artifacts, full of movement and activity. This landscape into which I was looking was older and more primitive, unchanging except as the weather and the seasons altered it. Chapter 5. Feet were coming down the stairs in the hall. The sound of them exorcised the vapors in my mind, and I was surprised at the way my pulse quickened. There was the rapid lightness of youth in the way the footfalls clattered on the stair treads, and I knew by their very sound who it was that was coming. Anne. It had to be Anne. What would she be like? 5 years make a lot of difference. I remembered the child, but it suddenly occurred to me that, much as we had been together in the old days, I had never noticed the woman that she was going to be. Naturally not, with Helen there and my whole eyes and heart centered on her. Anne had been, almost, my daughter, just as she had always seemed more like Helen's child than her sister. In the instant before she appeared, I found I could recall surprisingly little of what she had really been, as a person in her own right, and not merely Helen's much younger sister. All I was sure about was that when I had taken her to the circus or on a picnic, and later to plays and concerts, it had been fun. She had been quiet, with serious eyes, but when she laughed I remembered that I had laughed too, irresistibly. Of course, she must have changed, but I wished that she could be the same. When she came through the door, I had a momentary shock. She looked like Helen all over again. The same straight carriage, the same eyes set deep and wide apart, the round, strong throat. Then I noticed the differences. Helen had been white and gold, and this girl was brown, her hair and even the tan of her skin. Helen walked gravely, and there was always a reservation in her beauty. Anne, I saw, was not so stately. Her mouth was larger, even making allowances for the grin on it now, and her eyes were a darker blue. She was less conscious of herself, I felt, and more amazingly alive, though it may have been that the house and my own mood contributed to that impression. "Anne!" I said, and felt like laughing at something pleasant when I said it. "Uncle Dick!" She checked her rush forward and stood looking at me. "Good heavens!" "What's the matter?" She grinned again. "Why, it's just that, well, I guess I didn't remember you very well." She came over and shook me by the hand. "Welcome to Setauket Point." "What's the matter with me?" I demanded. "Have I changed?" "No, I thought you were an old man. I mean, not exactly old, but a lot older than you are." You don't seem to like my... I couldn't think of a word that wouldn't sound worse than inane. After all, you can't expect me to grow gray hair at 33. She sat down on the sofa beside me and went on looking at me in silence. The expression on her face delighted me. It was so obviously surprised and amused. After a time, she remarked, "Well, I'm used to it now, but I'm not going to call you uncle any more." "That's all right with me." I didn't want to be called anything of the kind after that first look at her. "You startled me when you came in yourself. For a second it was like seeing Helen again." She looked away quickly. "Don't say that." It had been a stupid remark, and I was sorry the moment I'd said it. "Anyway," I went on, "I'm glad to see you here, Anne." Even that was awkward. "You'll never know how glad I am to see you. I've been pestering Uncle Julian to write to you, but I never dreamed he really would. Why didn't you let us know you were coming?" I told her about the telegram and the taxi driver. "That's the way they are around here," she observed. "They don't like strangers. At least, they don't like us." "It's just the old New England reticence." She looked doubtful. "Probably. Only, well, let's not talk about that now." "How's Julian?" There was distress on her face. "He's changed. You'll be shocked when you see him. I was." "Mrs. Walters told me the same thing." "So you've seen her," she said, and then stopped abruptly. I thought she was listening. "Where is she, do you know?" "Where is she, do you know?" "She said she was going out in the kitchen to get breakfast." Anne glanced back at the door quickly and then began to speak in a low voice. "Look, Dick, I've got to talk to you, but not here. Later. Just follow any lead I give you, will you?" "All right, but—" She interrupted me by standing up. "Let's go see if breakfast is ready. You must be ravenous." I had something at what my driver called the E-light. She grinned again. "All you need is a couple of soda mints and another breakfast, and you'll get over that," she said, and led the way out of the room. "That is, if Elora Marcy's already here." I followed her. Her yellow sweater made the dark hall seem bright, and I noticed that she could wear slacks and not make the toe of my foot itch. This, I felt, was not going to be such an uncomfortable visit, nor so dreary as its opening had made me fear. I was still not adjusted to the idea of Anne's being grown up. After all, the first time I had seen her was when Helen left her in my charge for an afternoon, and, not knowing what you did with girls of 11, I'd taken her out to a drugstore and given her 2 chocolate malteds in succession. From then on, she had been just Helen's small sister as far as I was concerned, a youngster that I liked, but a little girl for all that. "Remember the chocolate malteds?" I said to her back as we went down the hall.
Yes.
Her laugh sounded good.
They make a pretty smooth malted in the Rexall store in town. The only good thing in Barsham Harbor, as far as I'm concerned.
We'll go sample them, I said.
It's a date.
As at the door to the kitchen, she paused.
Remember what I said,
she whispered, and pushed the door open. To my surprise, the kitchen was an agreeable room. It was in the northeast corner of the house, behind the room where I had been sitting, and though it was oh boy, I didn't expect that comma. To my surprise, the kitchen was an agreeable room. It was in the northeast corner of the house, behind the room where I had been sitting, and, though it was as dingy as the rest of the house, it looked a good deal more lived in. The sun was coming through the windows on our right and making the place bright. I noticed immediately that there was no dust, and that both the old stone sink and the kerosene stove were clean and as shining as their age and wear permitted. One thing that pleased me out of all proportion to its actual importance was a geranium growing in a chipped pot on the window-sill. It struck me as almost the first evidence I had seen that anyone thought of this house as a place in which to live. Mrs. Walters and Anne exchanged good mornings in an insincere fashion. I noticed that neither of them looked at the other.
I laid a place for you, Mr. Sayles. I'm sure you'll want something more besides coffee.
Thank you, I said. We all sat down at the table. The toast was just like the Elites, but the coffee was not so bitter. On the other hand, it was considerably weaker. I ate as much as I could in order to seem like the untroublesome guest, but I saw Anne watching me in amusement.
"Where's Mrs. Marcy?"
she asked after she had sampled her own helping of egg, which looked not so much scrambled as smeared.
"Late,"
said Mrs. Walters in a tone that implied she didn't care what Anne thought of the eggs. Then she smiled and remarked,
"You two young people must have some good times together." "Unaccustomed as I am to entertaining college professors," Anne remarked in a thoughtful tone, "I shall do my small best."
She turned to Mrs. Walters with what looked to me like a sweet smile. Too sweet.
"We already have a date."
"Oh?"
"Yes, for the cocktail hour and in the local drugstore."
This fencing between the two of them seemed likely to make an awkward moment even more so. I cut in quickly. "That is, unless Julie and I are busy then. After all, he's got first call on my time." Anne's eyebrows went up, but she said nothing. Mrs. Walters began to stack the dishes in the sink, her own plate scarcely touched. I wondered how she had managed to grow so heavy if that was all she ate. She looked from me to Anne thoughtfully, and finally remarked,
"I'll leave the dishes to you, Anne."
"Let me dry," I said. "I'm a great dryer. All-American my sophomore year."
"Very good."
Mrs. Walters sounded indifferent to the problem of the dishes.
"If Mrs. Marcy doesn't come soon, we'll have to find out what's delaying her."
She turned in the doorway.
"I'll let you know, Mr. Sayles, when Julian is awake."
"Thank you."
"Do you want me to fix a room for him?" asked Anne.
"Later,
after Julian is awake. I'll attend to that."
She replied and disappeared. Anne chucked a dish towel in my direction.
I didn't know you were planning to do any work with Uncle Julian," she observed.
"He asked me to give him some advice." Anne said nothing for an interval of 2 plates and a coffee cup. Then she looked up.
"What did she say when you told her that?"
"She didn't believe it at first. She acted odd about it."
She would."
"Look here," I said. "What is going on in this house? Who is this Mrs. Walters? What is she doing with Julian?" Anne turned from the sink and looked at me steadily. She was not smiling any more.
"I don't know."
The answer floored me. "But surely you must have some idea." She shook her head.
"I landed the 1st of August, and I've been up here ever since. But I tell you, Dick, I haven't. I can't find out."
"But hasn't Julian told you?"
"No. I hardly see him anyway, except at meals, and she's always there. I haven't been alone with him 4 times since I came."
She stopped abruptly and looked toward the door. It was still open, but there was no one there.
Anyhow, we'll take a walk later and a swim. I'd rather say nothing till then. She has ears like a cat.
We went on with the dishes. Just as we finished, the back door opened and a woman came in quickly. She was out of breath, and there was a comical look of apology on her thin face.
Morning, Miss Connor, she said quickly. I'm sorry I'm late, but I had to help Seth in the barn this morning. He's not so good again.
By the way Anne smiled at her, I could see instantly that she liked this little woman.
That's all right, Mrs. Marcy. We're making out.
Mrs. Marcy looked at the sink and gave a horrified gasp.
You're doing dishes. You ain't had breakfast already, surely.
Not really, Anne replied. Just something that Mrs. Walters prepared with her own fair hands. But that's not your fault. Professor Sales here arrived on the 6:20, and so we were roused out early. Dick, this is Mrs. Marcy, the only sane member of our happy household.
How do you do?
She said with a smile twitching at the corners of her mouth. I could see that Anne delighted her. Look out for him, that young lady went on. He's a college professor, and you know you just can't trust them. Absent-minded. Lots of mornings he forgets to put on his trousers, even. Mrs. Marcy giggled.
Looks like you both remembered this morning,
she observed with an eye on Anne's slacks. I laughed. Good for you, Mrs. Marcy, I said, and we shook hands. I see you know how to handle the younger generation here. She laughed. It's not so easy, but I do my best, Professor. Now, you give me that. And she removed the dish towel with one dexterous swipe. I don't allow any men to dry dishes in my kitchen. They ain't trustworthy. Anne observed. He's not so bad. Maybe not, but as time goes on, they get less and less help, more and more of a nuisance. Take my advice and start keeping him out of the kitchen right now. Anne avoided my eye. The voice of experience, she said lamely. Yes, child. I'll have to hump myself now, so you two run along. Oh, Miss Connor. What? Is she mad on account of my being so late? Good heavens, Alora. You're only a few minutes late. Don't worry about it. I don't want no ruckus with her. She looked as if she meant it, and yet it was hard to imagine that even Mrs. Walters could be severe with this person. She had the bright eyes and quick movements of a bird, and there was something ingratiating about the way she talked and smiled. Neither Anne nor I made a move to leave the kitchen in spite of her edict. Probably I wouldn't have believed at that moment that she was only 32. She looked 10 years older, and her hair was already fading into gray. 14 years of farm housework and the bearing of 4 children had faded her hair and skin, if not her eyes. She looked as if she didn't weigh more than 100 pounds. Later, after she was dead, I learned something of her story. Married the year she got out of high school and plunged at once into the grim business of making a living on a Maine farm. Yes, no, that is what it says. Okay. We're going to take that from the top. Married the year she got out of high school and plunged at once into the grim business of making a living on a Maine farm, she hadn't really had more than half her youth. The children had come along at intervals of a year or so, and after the 4th she was middle-aged. When she smiled, you could see what having them had done to her teeth, for one thing. Prematurely aged she might have been, but she was not old in her heart or her courage. She must have had to get up at 4 to do the housework at her own place before she came down the road to Julian's, but she was as lively that morning as if the day were just beginning. For her, instead of half over by any ordinary standards. Nothing daunted her, and the last thing she must have thought about was sparing herself. As I remember her again, I feel the sadness that comes when one thinks of a lost opportunity. I should like to have been able to do something for Mrs. Marcy. Anne was putting dishes away in the cupboard. Never worry about Mrs. Walters, she advised. If she doesn't like your being late, walk out and let her see how she enjoys running one place, let alone 2. Mrs. Marcy shook her head. We need the money. Seth's sciatica's back on him again. I don't know what we'll do if it gets any worse. That's a shame. I wish you'd let me help you.
That's sweet, child, but I'll make out.
She poured a cup of water into the geranium pot, and I understood then where the plant had come from.
You folks going to be staying on much longer? They was here till November last year.
Anne shook her head. I'm going away the 15th, but of course I don't know about Uncle Julian. I don't suppose he'll stay here all winter, but he might, and she'll stay as long as he does.
Oh, yes, agreed Mrs. Marcy. Well, the longer the better the longer the better for us.
Anne said, You need a vacation, in a tone that expressed how impossible she knew the idea was.
Not me, said the little woman brusquely, but it would be right nice for Seth if he could go south this winter. The cold doesn't do him any good. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'll just put the mop to this floor.
We went out the back door into the yard and stood there in the sun for a while. I filled my pipe, and Anne lit a cigarette. She must have seen some sort of look on my face, because she remarked, I've acquired a few bad habits, Dick, and laughed. I've acquired a few bad habits, Dick, and laughed. I apologized and told her not to mind me. The more I looked at her, with the sun putting red gold lights into her hair, the more I felt that it was going to be difficult to find a new basis for our relationship. If she had been a pupil in one of my classes, it would have been easy. I had long ago developed an immunity to all of them, no matter how charming. But Anne was a different problem. I felt responsible for her in a way, and there was the past in which she had loved me as her favorite uncle, and I had played with her, helped her when her homework was puzzling, given her elaborate toys at Christmas, and done all the other pleasant things which had seemed to stem naturally out of being Julian and Helen's closest friend. When they had married, I had been glad of Anne. She gave me an outlet for the frustration I had felt. 5 years had changed everything. That much I perceived. But what to do about bridging the gap I could not wholly see. It was a problem that solved itself quickly, but at the time it perplexed me. I did not want to go back into the past, and the present was decidedly odd. So I said nothing, but stood there smoking and looking at the sky and the bay, and every once in a while at Anne. Finally, she threw the end of her cigarette into the road. Well, this is nice, but I want to talk to you, Dick, and we're too close to the house. You know more about this neck of the woods than I do. Anywhere you say. Did you bring a bathing suit? When I told her that I had, she suggested that I get it, and I returned to the hall and my bag. Mrs. Marcy was dusting in the living room. I waved to her, but said nothing. In 3 minutes I was back on the road. Good, said Anne when I rejoined her. There's not much to do hereabouts, but the swimming makes up for it. We wandered along together, and it was pleasant. The air was beginning to feel warm, and you could smell the grass and the rich scent of the earth itself. My pipe tasted good, and the sun was warm on my back. Our shadows went across the field ahead of us, and by their lengths I judged that it was about 9 or perhaps later. I felt too content to bother with a watch. After 10 minutes or so, we came to the edge of the bay. Here, almost at the point's end, the shoreline was not marshy. We were actually standing several feet above the water and on the edge of a cut bank. Below us was a 20-foot crescent of brownish sand which was still in shadow and looked damp. Across the bay, and at least a mile to the southwest, the town lay white and green along the farther shore. This is where I swim, Anne said, breaking a long silence. We sat down and hung our legs over the edge of the bank. I come here twice a day sometimes, she went on. It's almost as private as if you were on an island. You need a place like this to come to, away from that house. I see what you mean. She turned her face to me, and there was a look of quiet contentment on it that I had not seen before. I came up here just to be with Uncle Julian a while, and because I thought I ought to come. It hasn't been much fun so far, but it was almost worth it just on account of lying in the sun here and watching the water. Sometimes it seems to me the river is alive. Yes, I said. Yes. She kept on looking at it for a time without speaking, and, as I watched her, I thought that it had been a long while since I had felt so baselessly happy and relaxed. The whole world was fresh and shining. The water was one shade of blue, the sky another. The meadow grass along the bank was stirring in a faint breeze. The air was sweet, and the sun was making Anne's hair gleam. Her face was half in shadow, but as I studied it, I could see that it was a woman's face, and not that of a child or a young girl. There was a character in it, strength in the spring of her jaw and the line of the cheekbone, but not obstinacy, humor in the corners of her lips. The young fellow that got her, I reflected, would have something worth holding on to. That thought ended by annoying me. I'd never believed Julian would pick out a place like this, I said.
That's the way I felt at first, she answered slowly, but I think he likes it. Not the way I do, but because it's so far away from everything. He doesn't want people.
For that matter, he never has.
I know.
She pulled a long stem of grass and put it between white teeth.
But he's more of a hermit than ever, Dick. Dick, he's changed. I said that before, didn't I? Well, I don't want to prejudice you, but I'm worried about him. He's so thin, too. He's not well at all.
Of course, Helen's death was an enormous shock to him. It was to all of us. She nodded, and without looking at me, asked,
You were in love with her, too, weren't you?
Yes.
Are you still?
It was a question I had not put to myself for a long time, and I was not sure of the answer. Helen's image was fresh in a part of my mind, but it did not hurt to think about her any more. A lot of water had flowed under the bridge since the time when I used to dream about her. No, I told her finally, I don't think I am.
I should have thought Helen, she began, and then hesitated. Why did she marry Uncle Julian instead of you?
Because she'd been married once before, I think. She looked puzzled.
I don't quite see that.
Well, Ed Norton was a louse. He treated your sister like he treated your sister like the dirt under his feet once he had got her, and she married him when she was too young. So he took all the youth out of her and made her afraid of passion and of the future. The divorce hurt her a lot, too. Helen wasn't the kind that could take a thing like that in her stride. What she wanted after that was something gentle and settled, and someone whom she could cherish, if you'll forgive the old-fashioned word, without having to love the way I wanted to be loved. Julian was peace and security to her, and he needed her. Besides, she had you on her hands. I grinned at her. You were a handful, too.
Anne nodded. She was practically like a mother to me.
She nibbled the stem of grass.
To Uncle Julian, too, in a way.
In another way, I agreed. He was 45 when he married her, and he'd never had anything like Helen in his whole life before. Everything he'd been suppressing up to then was fastened on her. He didn't love her, he adored her. God knows I had had ample opportunity to watch Julian's happiness. I knew more about it than anyone else possibly could. She gave Julian everything he'd ever had. Wait, did I read that correctly? Oh, she gave Julian everything he'd never had, a whole new life beyond his work. She brought him out into the sun. She was beautiful and she was kind, and she made him happier than he'd ever been.
No wonder, she said slowly, that he's so queer now. I never thought about it in quite that way you describe, but I can see you're right.
One word struck me sharply. Queer? I said. What do you mean by queer? For a time she did not answer, and there was hesitation in her silence. Finally she turned to me.
He's obsessed in some way, Dick. Some way that isn't natural, and it's connected with Helen in his mind. The only times we've really talked since I came up here were all about her. It made me feel creepy. He never mentioned her as if she were dead. You know, he'd say is instead of was, and so forth.
Oh, thanks for tuning in, Chris Camp. Yep, I do upload every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, unless some critical Scheduling conflict occurs, usually starting at about 12 noon U.S. East Coast time. Eastern... I don't know what it is, daily or standard. It's daylight saving, so I think it's Eastern Daily Time. 12 noon, which I realize isn't ideal for anyone to tune in at the top of it. But don't worry, they all get saved. And I update the playlists every month or so that those are organized.
You know, he'd say is instead of was and so forth.
I digested that for a time, and the more I thought about it, the more my heart sank. This visit was going to be a difficult one. The time before I had had no luck trying to argue Julian out of a preoccupation, and it sounded as if he hadn't forgotten anything. Still, I could not see just how a lot of the present facts were compatible with the unwelcome hypothesis that was forming in my mind. "What about this Mrs. Walters?" I inquired. "I don't see what she's doing here." Anne lay back on propped elbows and looked up at me with eyes squinted from the sun.
"You don't seem swept off your feet by the lady," she observed.
"I'm not, and I don't see what she's doing here."
"When I first came, I simply thought she was after Uncle Julian," she remarked. "But I'm not so sure now. She's been with him more than a year, or so I gather from things they've said, and she's with him all day. Anything that woman couldn't get in 6 months wouldn't be worth going after with a vacuum cleaner, so it can't be matrimony."
"Money, perhaps?"
She shook her head. "I don't think so. Uncle Julian isn't exactly rich, and he's been spending huge sums on all sorts of things for his laboratory, or whatever is in that room of his. I worry sometimes for fear he hasn't any left."
"How about yours?" I knew that Julian had been the trustee for Anne's inheritance. She and Helen had divided the Connor estate equally, and Helen had left her half to Julian. It must have amounted to somewhere around $70,000. Anne was to get her share outright when she came of age, and the idea that Julian could in any way have been false to that trust was too sickening to entertain. Still, I was relieved when she answered.
"Oh, mine is all right. He turned it all over to me on my 18th birthday. Government bonds it was in. I put them in a bank in New York."
She frowned and said,
"He wanted to borrow some the other day." "Good God!"
I said with a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach.
"How much?" $5,000.
"I suppose you gave it to him?"
"Not exactly. I told him he could have it if he'd tell me what was going on and why he needed so much."
"You shouldn't have promised even that. What did he say?" She sat up again and kicked the bank hard with her heels.
"He said he couldn't tell me, but that he needed some more equipment, and that once his work was finished, he thought he would be able to repay me. She heard about it and told me I was a fool, that I'd lost a chance at a fortune, and that he'd borrow it elsewhere. That was meant to make me feel bad," she observed, "but I didn't. I don't care about the money. Uncle Julian could have it as far as I'm concerned. But I tell you, Dick, I don't want him to go on the way he's going. He's so sick and old. I don't want her to have it either, but I'm sure he didn't want it for that. It was really for the thing he uses. It really was for the thing he uses. Twice since I've been here, a truck's arrived with cases and cases of things. I don't know what they were, but I think that he and she spend all their time up there working on something or other. In fact, I'm sure that that's all they do together. I don't think Uncle Julian cares about her, and I know she doesn't even like him. They watch each other sometimes. You'll see."
"I should think you'd be relieved that there's nothing more to it than that. You sound bothered."
She shook her head. "After you've been here a day, you'll be bothered too. I hate that house. I loathe the people in the town and the way they look at us. You'd think we were gangsters in a hideout."
There was defiance in her voice. "Well," I told her, "it isn't for long. Summer's almost over."
"Yes,"
she replied, but not as if the thought made her particularly happy. We sat there in the grass for a long time, talking about ourselves. She told me about the years since I had last seen her, most of them spent abroad. Behind her words it was easy to see that she had been lonely but unwilling to come home to Julian, whom she had never understood or loved without reservation. The fact that she called him Uncle Julian, and always had since Helen married him, was an indication of the way she felt toward him. And he, I suppose, was glad enough to have her take over the responsibility of her own life, leaving him free. She seemed to have done a good job of it, and a notably mature one. The allowance from her money had enabled her to travel modestly and study what she felt like, so she had gone first to London and then to Paris, looking into the things that interested her and doing a good deal of hard work, too. She told me she'd had a job in the export office of a French textile company, for one thing, and another as assistant to a woman in charge of the entertainments on a Mediterranean cruise ship. Then she had studied drawing and fashions, working bitterly long hours for almost nothing in a Paris couturier's shop, until she thought that she had something to offer in the way of experience. A buyer from one of the New York department stores had been impressed with her when she decided to look for an American job, and the upshot was that she was back in her own country with a position waiting for her on the 1st of October. She told her story with no sense of bravado, and I could see that what she had done suited her perfectly, however unlike the conventional thing it had been. It gave me a sense of satisfaction to know she was going to be in New York. When she asked me what I had been doing, I could not find anything to match her own account. A certain quantity of work performed, 2 promotions in academic rank, a few published articles, a couple of camping trips. That about summed up the 5 years. But it seemed to interest her. When I admitted that I was now an associate professor and in line to become a department head in a few years, she nodded as if she were satisfied. "You always did work hard," she observed. "I can remember that." She looked at me and grinned again. "But really, you aren't much the way I remembered after all. I expected to find you wearing a beard by now." I rubbed my chin. "If I don't manage to get a shave pretty soon, I'll be wearing one all right." She stood up. "Well, you'll find the house pretty primitive, but I guess the shaving can be managed. We don't have a tub, though. And if you want a bath, you'll have to take it in the river. I'm going in now." She made a grimace. "Swimming is absolutely the only entertainment we have to offer, and I've been doing a lot of it, twice a day when it doesn't rain. Even Mrs. Walters swims." After a pause, she added, "She swims well, too. You'd be surprised." I don't like to think of her in a bathing suit. Anne laughed. "It's quite a sight." "It's quite a sight." She pulled the yellow sweater up over her head, which disconcerted me until I saw that she had a bathing suit on underneath her clothes. "There's a clump of willows over there where you can undress," she observed, when her head emerged from the sea-water. "But look out for bees. I got stung once." I went over to the willows and got into my trunks, thinking about how warm and brown her shoulders had looked, and how fantastic it would have seemed to me yesterday to be told at 10 the following morning I should be thinking about a girl's skin and the sun on her hair. When I returned to the crescent of sand, Anne was already out in the water, swimming with an easy steadiness. I went in after her. The first shock of the plunge was breathtaking because the water was frost-cold, but after that it felt fine. The blood began to race under my skin, and I could feel the grubbiness of the train disappear in the swift rush of water along my body. I caught up with Anne a couple of 100 yards offshore, and we stopped to tread water and look around us. It was amazing how low the shores looked from where we were, and how distant. We were in a level world of blue which sparkled as we turned to face the sun. Anne shook the water swiftly out of her eyes and said, "Don't you like it?" "It's superb." Anne turned on her back and began to kick gently with her feet. "Nothing matters when you're out here," she said. "Everything's clean and—" She paused. She paused slightly. "Real." Then she said, "I'm glad you're here," turned over and began to swim toward the middle of the bay. I followed her, wondering why she had paused before she said, "Real." Then I stopped thinking at all, and we raced until we were winded. By that time the shore was perceptibly remote, and I began to notice the chill in the water. Anne had stopped too, and I looked at her, panting and laughing, with her head mounted on the flat water like John the Baptist's on a plate. "This water is pretty cold," I observed. "I'm used to it now," she answered, "but I'll have had enough in a few minutes. Let's swim back. Let's swim back slowly." So we did. I watched the flash and lift of her arm as it came out of the water, and the arc of the ripples that pushed along in front of her bathing cap. The sun caught the wet rubber and made a point of fire on it. I found myself matching my strokes to hers, so that we were I found myself matching my strokes to hers, so that we were swimming beside each other in the same rhythm, sliding through the water like parts of a single entity. The patch of fire on her cap held my eyes until I was half hypnotized without knowing it, and only the grating of my fingers on the beach snapped the spell. We stood up then and looked at each other. Drops of water fell from her body like fragments of light, and for an instant it seemed to me that there had been nothing whatever prior to this moment, that we had swum up out of some infinite reservoir of being until we stranded on the shore of the world. It is impossible to describe such an experience in the vocabulary of psychology, or any other, for that matter. It simply was. We stood there looking at each other, half smiling, not conscious of things, but of everything, fused into one universal sensation which vibrated in me to the tune of our swimming. I saw that Anne was lovely, smoothly and strongly made, but it was inevitable that she should be so. A sense of enormous contentment and satisfaction flooded through me. The enchantment began to dissolve. She gave a laugh and splashed through the shallow water to the beach. I followed, and we sat on a log together in the sun, without speaking. The heat began to take the water chill out of our bodies, and we relaxed. Anne stretched her legs ahead of her and dug her toes into the sand. "You see why I like to come here," she said. "Yes." "This was special, though," she said, half to herself, and I was glad, because I didn't want it to have been that fine every time before. After a while we got cigarettes and smoked until we were dry and warm. The sun was high, and I began to remember why I had come to Barsham Harbor. "Julian must be up by now," I said. "Probably I ought to be getting back to the house." "All right," Anne replied, and there was regret in her tone. We pulled on our clothes, and I had to be diplomatic about that because she was right about the bees. There were a dozen of them buzzing in the willow alcove where I dressed. Afterwards, we walked back across the meadow, not saying much. Halfway to the house, I said, "I'll let you know what Julian has to say, and then we can have another talk." "Yes," she added. "Yes." Then she added earnestly, "Try to see him alone. Don't let her be there when you talk to him, or you'll never learn anything." "All right, but don't take her too much to heart. She's not the companion for a summer vacation, I admit, but there's no point in resenting her." She looked at me steadily. "I don't resent her," she answered. "I'm afraid of her." "Nonsense." She said nothing to that, and we walked on to the house. The magic had gone, and we were just two people again, each wrapped in our own thoughts. We walked slowly.
And with that, I've got to call it good for today. A bit of a short one this Wednesday. My apologies for that. My time is pressured at the moment. But we will continue this next week. We will continue reading more of On the Edge of Running Water. Or, on the Edge? Or is it just The Edge? Let me double check. The Edge of Running Water. We will continue reading that next Wednesday. This Friday, we have more of The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson to get through, where our protagonist may have indeed found the place where his own old love, Mirdath, or rather Nani, may reside, the Lesser Redoubt. And then next Monday, we will continue reading through Legend of the Galactic Heroes, Volume 1, Dawn, by Yoshiki Tanaka. So, much to look forward to. For near future, after we get done the things we are reading at the moment, we've got, let's see. So, what I plan on reading next on Mecha Mondays is the Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam novelization, which has been fan translated. I have to double check who did the fan translation. I do not remember off the top of my head. I have to actually get down to proofreading that. I've only gotten through like the first quarter of it. I have to read the rest. Easy to do. I just have to get off my duff, or get on my duff, as the case may be, and just hop to it. On Wednesdays, after we finish with reading this that we've just embarked on, we'll get down to reading Cytine by C.J. Cherry, one that I've been looking forward to reading aloud on stream for a while now, and have harped on the virtues of for some time. And then after we get done with The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson, we will get on to, pretty much immediately. We will get started on Endymion by Dan Simmons, the sequel to, or the follow-up to the Hyperion Cantos. So, much to look forward to. Many voices I'm going to have to do, and a lot of reading. It is going to take a while to get through Cytine. It is going to take a while to get through Endymion. They are both pretty long. Endymion is 2 books. It's Endymion, is it The Rise of Endymion? I think it's Endymion and The Rise of Endymion. I have them combined in one volume. We'll just do them back to back, because why not? Cytine has a sequel in Regenesis. I may do a brief breather between the two, just to let that one cook a little, but it starts more or less immediately after, so I might just get down to it and start reading that right after. After all that, I have no idea what I'm doing. That's months out at this point. It is going to take quite a while to read through those. But yeah, if you want to catch me live, you can. I stream until something changes, which it might. I stream at every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 12 noon U.S. East Coast time, which I think is UTC minus 5, now that it's daylight savings. I should check that. Anyway, it's Eastern time, U.S. East Coast time, or Eastern Daily Time, Eastern Standard Time, whichever one it is this time of year. My brain isn't working too well at the moment. It rarely seems to be. I know it seems to all of y'all listening here that my brain never seems to really be in the right place. And I promise you that is only slightly less true than it appears. So yeah, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, starting at about 12 noon. If you can't catch them live, don't worry about it. I don't monetize any of this. I do this out of a sense of love of the game, so to speak. It's a hobby. It's a fun hobby that I do for personal enjoyment, and I'm just glad other people dig it too, including Chris Camp. Thank you for tuning in. If I misread your name earlier, I apologize. I was squinting at it from a bit of a distance. So thank you again. But yeah, no, I do it pretty reliably. I'm not, sometimes scheduling conflicts occur. Not terribly often. I am probably going to have some in the near future. Let me see. Because I'm in the midst of a bunch of different books, I am probably, well, it's on a Thursday, so I don't have to worry about it. I could do something for Christmas Eve. Let me see if I get this book done. I'll see if I can find some seasonal short stories for Wednesday, the 24th of December. So we'll see about that. Tentatively, I just want to get started on all the other stuff that I've got booked out. But one day for seasonal stuff, I don't think is a problem. I'm not strictly adhering to a schedule. If things do change in my schedule, I will let people know. The first place you'll be able to find out about that is on my Discord channel. I am I'm not necessarily terribly thrilled with Discord. If somebody knows of an adequate replacement that isn't social media proper, which I like even less, then please let me know. Yes, strictly speaking, I could use something like Blue Sky or Mastodon, but I am lazy. And also, I will be honest, I do not go in for social media by and large. So communicating with me is something you have to either do with me live, in the comments, after the fact, and I'll respond to you if I remember or if it demands a response, or on the Discord where you can get me pretty much any time. Yeah. Yep, that's it. Again, I don't ever plan on monetizing this. I may set up a Patreon or something later because people have expressed an interest in throwing money my way. And far be it from me to not engage with capitalism, but at the same time, I never want it to feel like a job because then I won't want to do it anymore. And I do want to keep doing this. I have so many books to read you people. You have no idea. So many. I did, I have changed microphones since, if you've been listening to, because I think the comment I saw you leave that I may or may not have responded to was on Hyperion. I have changed microphones. Hopefully it is better. It seemed clearer to me when I was listening to it, but I don't like listening to the sound of my voice much, so I didn't give it a whole lot of time, if I'm honest. Audio levels and whatnot are all negotiable. I can tweak things accordingly if I'm given feedback at all. I just need feedback. So feel free to leave some. Positive, negative, it doesn't matter. I need to know it. So I can fix things if they are broken or not working or are bad. It is not necessarily ever going to be professional quality. I do not have a soundproof location. You will hear noises. Generally, you won't hear clocks. I goofed and left my door open and my clocks bong, but fortunately they don't bong lots. I have a view, but I'm not going to show it to you. The one thing I regrettably must promise is that you will never see me. It's not that I'm an ogre per se, and it's not that I live in a cockroach-infested, slovenly mess. I'm just not going to dox myself like that. But I do have a view. I can describe some of it to you, but I won't tell you where I am, other than I am overlooking a body of water, small, a river of sorts that curves through a town, which is enough, I think. You won't see it, but I will. I have some concerns about personal security. I don't believe that you personally would be trying to do me ill. I just kind of basic safeguarding of certain personal details about my current state of life that I feel are best not discussed. Oh, you're in Turkey. That's very nice. That's great. Oh gosh, that means it's the evening for you then, by quite a bit. What's the time zone in Turkey? I can't remember now. That's at least 6 hours, 7 hours. A farming community by the sea. That sounds lovely. Where I'm at, I'll be honest, the town I'm in is a former mill town, so it is dying in its way slowly. It has little things that it'll boost population up and down, but mostly it's a place. It's a place where people are constantly leaving, rather than going to. There are some things because it is kind of a county seat. So it's more populated than it could be, but it's a quiet, pastoral life that rather fits my pace. 10 at night, yeah, okay. That makes it tough, I imagine, for you to tune in live, but that's okay. I don't expect people to. If I ever change my schedule, I'll try and make it known. But if it works for you, great. I guess it works for you a little better than it might otherwise, because otherwise somebody's having to do it as a lunch break, whereas you can at least do it as an evening listening exercise. So that's good. Yeah. Okay. So that is it's 8 hour time difference. I'll try and keep that in mind. I'm babbling. I do that. These post-reading stream yaps are always devolving into me babbling about things, but it's always nice to catch up with people who are listening. I do always appreciate that and feedback. Oh yeah, yeah. No, you're not alone either. It's I'm always kind of surprised at how much feedback I get, where people are like, "Oh yeah, it's great not to have an AI voice doing this, or some sort of AI generated or robot generated machine voice doing it. It's really reassuring." And I'm like, "That's all I ever wanted. Yes, yay!" It pleases me, is what I'm saying. But yeah, if you do have suggestions for books you want read, feel free to hit me up with them. I can't promise that I will get to them in a timely fashion or ever, but I will certainly consider them. Usually, if it's a book I haven't read yet, I will have to get around to reading it first. I like to vet things. I will occasionally read something more or less blind. I've done it before. But I generally like to vet it beforehand so I can at least know how I'm going to read it, and it can sit and percolate in my head for a while. With that said, though, I do have to run. Thank you again for tuning in, everyone who has tuned in. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. If I'm ever talking too fast or too slow or not clearly enough, call me on it and I will adjust accordingly or do my best. With that, I gotta run. See you all later. Toodaloo!